The most dangerous part isn't that you think people might leave, it's that your brain has already filed their absence as inevitable, and now you behave like the ending happened before the relationship even began. That silent assumption changes everything before you ever notice it. You call it being realistic, being guarded, reading people well. But what your mind labels intuition is often threat perception circuitry running on old data, a nervous system that learned too early that closeness predicts loss. So now every delayed reply, every subtle shift in tone, every moment of distance is processed less like information and more like confirmation. Your brain is not asking what is true, it is scanning for proof that the story it memorized years ago is happening again. And there's a deeper reason this pattern keeps repeating that has almost nothing to do with the people in front of you. The real question is not why others leave, it's why some part of you seems to need to know they will. That is the loop most people never catch, and by the time it reveals itself, it has already shaped entire years of connection. What you're experiencing is often the result of attachment conditioning fused with nervous system activation. In plain human terms, your body learned that emotional closeness is not neutral, it is risky. If early bonds carried inconsistency, abandonment, criticism, emotional unavailability, or unpredictable affection, the brain begins coding intimacy as a threat variable, not consciously, biologically. The amygdala, your internal alarm system, starts tagging vulnerability with danger. So before love feels like warmth, it feels like exposure. This is where the avoidance reinforcement loop begins. The observable behavior is simple. You detach early, test people silently, overanalyze signals, become hyper-aware of shifts, or emotionally withdraw before anyone can surprise you. But beneath that behavior is an unconscious protective mechanism far more sophisticated. Your identity is trying to preserve itself from the humiliation of being unwanted. Distance becomes less about preference and more about identity preservation bias, the mind's need to protect the version of self that says, "I saw it coming, so it can't destroy me." That's why the pain of people leaving is often secondary. The deeper terror is what their leaving seems to prove. Not "they're gone," but "I was right about myself." Unworthy, replaceable, too much, never enough. The nervous system would rather maintain a painful certainty than risk an unfamiliar safety. John Bowlby's attachment theory explained this with brutal elegance. The mind builds internal working models of relationships from early experiences, and those models become predictive maps for future bonds. In everyday language, your childhood did not just teach you how to love, it taught you what to expect when you do. So now your adult relationships are often less about the present person and more about the past template your brain overlays onto them. Imagine your mind as a smoke alarm installed in a house that once burned down. The fire is over, the walls are rebuilt, the rooms are different, but the alarm is now so sensitive it screams at steam, candlelight, even sunlight through the blinds. That is what abandonment conditioning feels like. The system is not broken, it is overcalibrated by history. And because it once protected you, your brain keeps trusting it even when it starts sabotaging the life you actually want. This is the part no one warns you about. Eventually, the fear of being left stops being a reaction and becomes a behavior pattern that quietly manufactures the very outcome it dreads. You become colder when you need reassurance. You become suspicious when someone gets close. You interpret neutrality as rejection. You punish uncertainty with emotional retreat. On the surface, it looks like caution. Underneath, it is survival coding. This creates one of the cruelest contradictions in social rejection psychology. The people most desperate for permanence often become the hardest people to stay close to, not because they are difficult, but because their threat perception circuitry confuses consistency with vulnerability. When someone stays, the real danger begins, not abandonment, but the possibility of finally being seen. And that is the hidden identity flaw the mind protects at all costs. If someone truly knows you and then leaves, it feels like a verdict. So the psyche begins controlling exposure. It edits itself. It performs emotional self-containment. It never fully arrives. This way, if the relationship collapses, the mind can say they never had the real you anyway. But every time you do this, the brain updates its model incorrectly. It concludes, see, no one stays. It never registers that they were never allowed to reach the part of you that needed staying in the first place. This is where it becomes self-sabotage. Notice the dual layer: observable behavior, distancing, people testing, pessimism, low trust. Hidden mechanism: fear that authentic visibility will trigger rejection. The brain is not merely predicting loss, it is engineering controlled loss because chosen pain feels safer than surprise pain. Here's the destabilizing truth. Sometimes your loneliness is not caused by abandonment. It is maintained by anticipatory abandonment. Your system exits emotionally before reality gives it a reason. That changes your tone, your patience, your warmth, your ability to interpret ambiguity. People can feel when they are being treated like future evidence instead of present connection. And if unchanged, this pattern tends to harden into identity. Not, I fear people leave, but I am someone people eventually leave. Once it fuses with self-concept, every relationship becomes a courtroom where ordinary human imperfection is cross-examined as proof of eventual departure. And this is where it turns. The pattern is not really protecting you from people leaving. It is protecting you from grief, from helplessness, from the collapse of the self-image you built around emotional independence. The hidden cost is enormous. You don't just lose people, you lose the ability to experience them without pre-loss. Every moment becomes haunted by its ending. So instead of intimacy, you rehearse absence. Instead of presence, you monitor for shifts. Instead of receiving love, you audit it. That pressure changes how others feel around you. They sense the evaluation, the guardedness, the invisible exit strategy. Over time, even emotionally healthy people start feeling like they're relating to a locked room. And eventually, many do pull away, not because your fear was accurate, but because your fear shaped the environment. That is the long-term relational consequence no one wants to admit. The brain's attempt to prevent abandonment can slowly create emotional conditions where connection cannot breathe. The hardest part is what this reveals about self-image. You may have built an identity around being the one who doesn't need anyone, the one who sees endings before they arrive, the one who just understands how people are. But that image may be less wisdom and more scar tissue wearing the mask of intelligence. The existential question from the beginning now closes. Why does part of you need to know they'll leave? Because certainty feels safer than hope. Because if the ending is mentally preloaded, the nervous system believes it can reduce impact. But all it really does is force you to live the loss twice, once in anticipation, once in reality. The clarity is uncomfortable but clean. Your brain is not trying to ruin connection. It is trying to preserve psychological continuity. It wants your world to remain narratively consistent, even if that consistency is painful. Familiar pain is easier for the system to regulate than unfamiliar security. That's why healing this pattern is less about trust in others and more about updating the body's relationship to uncertainty. The real shift begins when the mind stops treating possibility as prophecy, when a delayed response becomes just a delayed response, when distance stops automatically meaning disappearance, when silence is no longer translated into self-worth. The deeper realization is that your loneliness may not be proof that no one stays. It may be proof that your mind has been loyal to an outdated survival map. And once you see that map, you start noticing this pattern everywhere, in rejection sensitivity, emotional avoidance, overthinking, and the quiet ways identity forms around absence. That larger psychological universe is where the real story continues, because the assumption that people leave is rarely the first wound. It is usually the adaptation that follows another one. So if this felt less like a video and more like a mirror, stay close to where this psychological thread goes next, because the mind that expects abandonment almost always learned that expectation from somewhere deeper, and that deeper layer is where the real unraveling begins.